So welcome everyone to NewViews. We're a civic forum where creative agency meets civic imagination. Our goal here is to improve our civic messaging. That's ultimately, like, you can judge this panel. Let me know afterwards if you feel like you've connected dots that you haven't before. And the cool intersection of today is the combination of space, entrepreneurship, and civics. So I feel like rarely do we see these three coming together, but I feel like space is the perfect example of pushing the frontier of what's possible and with new technologies. And we can learn a lot from our panelists, which I'm super stoked about and so grateful for them being here. And, you know, the values of this program are super important because I feel like it's hard to have civic conversations these days. You know, we have to get better at it. So I want this to be a true forum. So whenever you see the QR code come up, it's going to come up every few minutes. I really encourage you to type into the chat if you feel like you've connected a new thought. You can also use the technology to ask questions and upvote questions. So if you see someone else's question that you want prioritized, upvote it, click on it, because ultimately at the end, we want to have the best use of our 80 to 90 minute time together. So we want to crowdsource the best questions. And I know all you out there have great questions. So please keep that in mind. And we'll try and get to them as often as we can. But again, we're going to ground this in respect, empathy, thoughtfulness, some touchstones of, like, if we say something, you know, that maybe landed wrongly, you know, we can talk to each other like, you know, maybe we could work on that phrasing a little bit, or, you know, let's think about this a little differently. So these are the goals and values of this program. And I hope that we continue to grow this monthly here. And we're so grateful to Venture Cafe. Cynthia, do you want to say anything to begin?
Sure. So welcome to Venture Cafe. I'm Cynthia. I'm the Program Experience Coordinator here. And, you know, as Tom said, one of the biggest challenges that we face as species is climate change. And we spend so much time focusing, yes, here on Earth as we should, that we often forget to look below or above in a lot of ways. And we have people, thousands of people who are actively working in these spaces. And so why are we not bridging these gaps between space, Earth, the ocean? It's all a part of the same universe. And so with that, I would also actually, if it's okay, I would also like to invite one of our other community members up here. He is not part of the panel. However, he brings into this conversation two worlds that also have a hard time coexisting, which is space entrepreneurship and actually raising money and having a successful business. So, Manoj, if you wouldn't mind joining us.
Yeah. And, you know, as Manoj, let's welcome Manoj up here, everybody. And just so everyone knows the format, we'll have Manoj speak, and then we're going to go into 3 one-on-ones with our guests, about 10 minutes each. And then we're going to go into the panel format, which is really where, like, the questions, and we're going to dive deeper into the forum. So just to give you guys the insights, and Manoj, take it away.
All right, thank you.
Take the center stage too.
Of course. I got worried about the crowd there. I'm not used to a very big crowd when space people talk. So this is my kind of crowd, which is like 10, 15 people. So just to introduce myself, Manoj Koshi. I'd be more known to the space community as the head of pricing strategy for a satellite imagery company named Planet Labs. They are one of the coolest companies in the space world, which is a small world to begin with. So a handful of companies, they are one of the, I would say, better of the lots who's come out. They've gone public, they've made some money, they've gotten some traction. But I think the simple words I have to say is that space is very hard. Business in space is extremely hard. Raising money, close to impossible. I think there's a lot of challenges with that. And just wanted to touch upon a few things. I think if you go back into the history of space, actually, the space economy, if you look at all the PwC reports and all the market research reports that's coming out, every time you'll see this number like $3.2 trillion. That is the market that space has got. By 2027, it's going to hit $5-7 trillion. Now, the reality is, God knows if those numbers are real, but it's a very big market apparently. It's important to split space into multiple domains. There is like space communication that's happening, internet and all those things. Then there is a bunch of people who's trying to go to space. Elon Musk has been trying to go to Mars. Blue Origin, they've been trying to find their way to space as well. And then I belong to this very niche space of Earth observation imagery, which is people historically have sent up satellites to space. They look out into space. There is no money there other than finding aliens and stuff. So what they decided is they decided to turn down the satellites. They look down now, and they figured that, okay, we should help humanity, and there are other things to help, and there is money there. So that's where it really started with. Back in the day, if you go to history, you'll see that NASA had this program called Landsat, which started in, I think, 1972, if I'm not mistaken. That they had a bunch of satellites that went up. What it really did is it kind of helped with climate change, understanding climate for the first time, and understanding different aspects of like how Earth was changing in itself. So that's where it really started. Those imagery are available for free. Since then, people have always expected imagery to be available for free. So no one is really ready to pay money for these kind of things. That's the harder part. Commercialization is extremely hard on space. Fast forward many years, I think the real, and of course, no offense to any Europeans here, Europeans were feeling left behind. So ESA, European Space Agency, what they did is they sent up a bunch of satellites to compete with Landsat, called in the Copernicus program. Those are Sentinels. Amazing imagery, actually. But the real commercialization of Earth observation started in early 2000s when the intelligence agency in US decided to commercialize space imagery. They had an early project called Clearview, which they opened it up to, I think it was in 2002 or 3. They opened it up to the commercial companies, and the company named Digital Globe won that contract, along with 2 other companies, I believe. They had in which the US government guaranteed that they'll give a specific amount of contract to these companies. So it was $500 million or something like that per year. Fast forward many years, in 2007, I think they renewed the contract. It was called NextView. Then in 2010, the contract got even bigger. It was called Enhanced View. Great naming. But I think that is when the venture capital industry, of course, they figured that there is a lot of money here. Somehow, people are trying to commercialize imagery, and they kind of figured that there is money to be made, and then they started pumping money into the space industry. Then comes companies like Planet Labs. After Planet Labs, I think it started in 2010. They didn't make any money till like 2018. 2018 is when I joined. I don't want to say that I helped make money for them, but anyway, so 20. And then a few other companies came along, like there was Spire, Satellogic, Capella. There's a bunch of companies now. There's actually a lot of companies. In 2021, I think alongside also the US government kind of opened up from a policy standpoint to allow satellite imageries to be taken, which was a pivotal point in the space industry in itself. So that was Earth observation. And then I think now the notion is like, how do you help imagery? Imagery, when you talk about imagery, it's nothing but sensors. So these sensors looking down, they're imaging Earth. You take that data and you are trying to help climate change. You're trying to understand methane gas emissions. You're trying to detect objects, road detection, building detection. Ironically, people use in their daily lives these images or these derived products from space. Like one simple thing that you see is Google Maps. If you look at those Google Maps lines, these are nothing but road detections. These are taken from space imagery, and it's derived from that. So people touch upon in their daily lives these components from space and like these transformations from space. Of course, Google themselves don't want to pay for this. So they use this open, I forget the name now, there is an open source road thing that Google and Apple actually take it from. So there's not a lot of money here. It's hard, but I think with climate and with government supporting it, there is a lot of funding that's coming through. There are multiple challenges with this industry in itself. One is there is a lot of every government takes great pride in making imagery. So they have their own companies building satellites, and they kind of want to promote that. The other one is there is a lot of government interference into the imagery industry in itself. So people expect it to be free, which makes it very, very complicated. So there is like commercialization is incredibly complicated. And I think the new era is where there is this downstream transform derived products. So it's opening up to an industry from a very niche community. It's opening up to like data scientists now. So I believe it's another 3, 4, 5 years. A lot of things have to work simultaneously, which is the communication, the actual. If you look at the space in itself, right, it's nothing but you have hardware in space that's collecting data. It's downlinking to Earth. You're putting it into like a pipeline, which is nothing but Google, AWS, or one of that. You're running computer vision, which is like creating insights out of that, and you are giving it to people, giving it to businesses. That is it's a very simple notion if you think about it. But there are complexities with that. I think one of the big challenges also like the insights haven't kicked in yet, which is there's a lot of use cases like agriculture, one big use case. Companies like Bayer, Syngenta, they use it inside out. But if you look at it, taking that data, transforming, understanding in-field changes during the growing season for farmers, it hasn't really benefited farmers in theory. Farmers haven't started producing more corn, wheat, or anything. The yields haven't improved. So there's a lot of great science happening. It's still, I would call, it's no more a science project. It's actually something in between science project and commercialization, but it's very close. Actually, I think it'll be at least 3, 4 years before the commercialization happens. Sorry, I ranted a lot, but.
So from what it sounds like though, historically, there just hasn't been much initiative to commercialize it because it's so far out, literally. And so the thought now is that if we can work together to commercialize it within the next 3 to 5, like if we put an emphasis on it and we actually see the value of it, i.e. through our everyday technologies like GPS and things like that, then we would actually see that the space industry is worth putting money and investing into.
Exactly.
Okay.
The government has to step in. Actually, the policies have to change significantly. The government has to really come forth. The carbon initiative is one good initiative that the government has done, but like they have to help these companies commercialize the technology. It's a great space. It's actually very efficient compared to having sensors on the ground. It's not like there are so many amazing use cases, but I think the people are still struggling to find optimal use cases. That is the challenge. It's gonna take a little bit of time to get that.
And I think that's a good lead into our panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause. And I think that if you guys have technology questions for Manoush, then by all means still use this to ask, and we can kind of circle back, and have a conversation about it at the end. It's all about the questions we ask. I think like that's again a huge theme of this program. So I would love to welcome up Ivana to be our first, one-on-one here. You're center stage. So I want to start by asking kind of, and as an introduction to the group here, what led you to this moment in your career path? What were the aha moments that led you to be this amazing AIML, NASA space, professional that is leading the industry forward in a lot of ways and looking to be a leader in this space? What were the aha moments for you to like push forward your work and get you to where you are now?
All right. Well, first of all, I have to just say this. This is all my opinions, not NASA's opinions. So I just had to make sure I say that up front. But thinking about my aha moments, it's actually funny. I'm sure many people in the room can relate, but it's almost like a chain of aha moments up to like the final aha of being in the space industry. But I think I'm an AI researcher. I got my PhD at Tufts, actually, local. And I think like I had an aha moment when I realized that I wanted to do AI for like something that wasn't gonna like mess things up on Earth, like in a negative way. And like there's really nothing cooler than exploring space, right? And I figured it would be far enough out that I wouldn't be hurting anyone. And to be honest, like the other major aha was when I got my first internship at NASA. I remember I gave a presentation on my work for the summer, and it was like the silliest little project I did ever. It was so simple. I don't even think it worked, but I remember after my presentation, like this way older guy from NASA came like running into my room. He had like a big white mustache and white hair, and he was like, "I was so interested in that." I think the aha moment was like, "I want to be at this place. Like, I really like it here."
What about the kind of future of AI, machine learning, really excites you, and, maybe help for our audience define what that means? And like, maybe we can just briefly touch on like, what are some misconceptions, and like, so that we can ground our messaging here and our thought.
I'm obsessed with the idea of using AI in space for like finding active life. That's just my opinion, not NASA's opinion. I'm obsessed with that idea. So like that to me is like, that is something that really excites me about the use case, like smart instruments to find active life in our lifetime. So I think of just being a part of NASA, there's so much heritage and like pride being there, like maybe not as much pay, but like it's just like the idea that at some point like NASA put a man on the moon. It's just like I want one of those moments while here. And then as far as like how do we, the other question was just like how do we understand better AI?
Yeah.
I always say this, like I think it's really important to increase AI literacy in general at our organizations, the government, and publicly, and have a better understanding of the field, because it's a lot more than just machine learning. So like you said, you wanted this conversational. So like when people say AI/ML, that's not correct. Because AI is and machine learning is a subset of AI,
Okay.
right? So I've said this at NASA too. It's like saying science/physics, right? And so like understanding the field, but then understanding that it's composed of so much more than just the computer science side, which is what I do. There's like cognition, philosophy, neuroscience. It's like a really rich field. And to that end, the more you increase your education in the area, you actually understand better that like there's not as much to like fear. That this is just my opinion. There's not. It's emergent technology, and that's something that's been around. Emergent technologies forever, right? So I think that people fear like this idea of sentient agents, and I don't think we're that close to that. But in any case, I just think it's more approachable when you really understand how diverse the field is. So yeah.
AI is a tool, and we've been using it growingly for the last 60 years in a lot of different capacities. So if we are to become this sustainable species, we're going to need this tool to help us. In your work at the NASA Goddard Flight Center, what projects excite you, and how can you inspire our audience on what you're working on?
So I'm a mission resilience lead of a constellation mission design concept, and I love this project because it's a constellation. So it's supposed to be a swarm of small sats that we're trying to like essentially engineer a blueprint for it. But they actually decided to put like different PIs and just like squish us together like a true constellation. We don't have like a central PI, which is really interesting. So the actual format of working is an experiment. But the idea is that we want to have like this new way of like, instead of these larger like flagship missions, we want to try to do things like more fleet based. There's a lot of science advantages to that, like multi-vantage point measurement and such. But what really excites me is like kind of where we envision those fleets could go. And once again, like, could we find like some kind of active life on another planet? So that's why I'm also excited about the idea of putting the smart instruments across an entire fleet, like to increase our opportunistic science abilities. So yeah.
Can you bring us through your vision of how in your lifetime we're going to find life on out beyond Earth, and what would that mean to like change our perspective? Why is it so important that we set that mission to do that?
Well, so this is interesting. Sometimes I feel like in our careers, we really think really hard about things. And sometimes it's more of this like intuitive gut feeling thing. And I really typically just go with gut feelings for a lot of what I do. Like I didn't even overthink my choice of like going to NASA or getting a PhD. I actually was out in Boston when I accepted my PhD position. I was like, I guess I'll do that. And so and similarly with NASA, there was other random reasons why I was at NASA. But I think what I'm so excited about is like just unifying us, like just being like the idea of finding life on another planet. I don't know. I just think about like what it was like being on Earth when like they put a man on the moon. Just everybody is literally watching, right? Like I just feel like there's this unification of just being like, forget all the problems that we like face with each other. Like that is cool and everybody knows it's cool, right? Like that would just be amazing. So that's kind of what I hope will happen in my lifetime. And I really honestly I think it can. My opinion. Like if we start innovating, especially like in partnership, like we actually have a shot at that.
I want to get to the consortium partnership models as a panel. I feel like there's going to be a lot of good discussion on that. You know, I think you touched on the story of DEIA and how in our public spaces we need to make sure that these policies are forefront what we do to create this more equitable workforce, especially on the public side, which we can create through policy. Could you just walk us through like your vision and like now that you're a leader, like how your experience and your story of your intern from Louisiana, like how impactful that was, and maybe that story can resonate with us here.
Yeah, that's actually, so I did get permission from my intern to tell the story because it's a little bit like of a close, it's like an intimate story, but I think like I've realized like the DEIA component actually like now being in a leadership role, I feel it a lot more than I did when I was just like on the grind trying to like prove myself all the time. And I've realized like, so I have an intern that I hired a couple of years ago, like 2 years ago, and she's from Louisiana and I'm from Boston. And she, at the end of our internship, she like was talking to me a little bit about her background and her past because she was like pretty much writing letters to get into grad school. And she told me at the end of the internship, first of all, like her computer, the entire internship was broken. Did not know that. So she like saved our research project with her broken computer. So I was like, thank God. She had never been like an hour away from her hometown and like never been on a plane. And I was pushing her to like get a PhD in Boston because I love Boston. And so it really hit me. And I was like, wow, this is like, without this kind of like pushing her and like really getting to know her, like this wouldn't have happened. So now she's doing her PhD at Tufts. And she still works closely with me. And like, believe me, she's still in culture shock mode being up here. But like for the DEI component, I think I've realized like, it's just not optional. So it takes a lot of work to mentor anyone. Like I was always an athlete growing up, like being a coach, being whatever, like that takes work. It takes an investment in time. And I think that like one thing I've noticed with DEIA is like the one figurative unit that you put in, you get like 5 units back with like a lot of students and like DEIA like folks because they just have to work a lot harder. So yeah, I think that we need to start thinking more about the fact that it's this long-term like relationship building. And it's like for me, it's fully grassroots for me. Like, yeah.
From a run of show perspective, so like basically each panelist gets this 10-minute slot, just so you know that again this is another device to help us keep on schedule. I want to touch on the fact that NASA's concept of like failure isn't an option. How does that actually limit innovation in your space, and how do you think that we could shift our strategies to create a more innovative public space sector?
So yeah, I think so. One thing that's interesting about NASA or being in the government is like it's tax dollars, so you feel a certain responsibility to like do things with people. Like you really do feel that pervasively, or at least I do. So I understand like the pressure failure is not because I'm always thinking about the fact that like I'm frugal with like how I do my research. Like if I have $1, I want to knock it out like $5 with research. But I think that and we do have like a really heavy culture toward that. But I've really been pushing this is like partnering externally and trying to just be a part of like industry culture. So that's why I'm here right now, right? And my duty station is here in Massachusetts. I got approved to stay here to start working like AI partnerships and stuff in Massachusetts. So I'm really excited to be doing this. And I just realized like, I mean, from a objective point of view, like rapid prototyping, like agile ways of development is something that we should be doing. But I mean, it's hard. Like when I saw like the SpaceX thing, like explode or whatever, I was like thinking about like that's stressful, right? But I don't know how that would go over if that happened in the agency. But yeah, I think truly partnership is the way to go.
How could we work on, and we'll circle back to this on the panel too, but like how can we work on getting the public more involved in like long-term funding efforts to make sure that, we're not switching back and forth our funding for your initiatives and the research, because we can't really get to find life if we don't create a plan and a funding system for that.
No, I mean, it's funny, even internally I face that. Like I run on like internal research and development money. So it's like that gets reevaluated all the time too. I think that, so I'm really pushing for actually, if you look at like the NASA 2022 strategic plan, this is something that's just also aligned with the things I believe in personally. We're pushing toward like open sourcing. We're actually open sourcing my architecture like within the next month. Can't wait. So, well, I got tired of waiting for partnerships to go through. So I was like, I'm just going to put it public and then, but yeah, innovation could happen. Right. And so so that way when I have interns, they can continue engineering with that architecture after their internship. But open sourcing is a huge part of it. And I think trying to make the partnerships process more streamlined, because that's sometimes just partnerships can take 1 year for a 1 year partnership, to go through officially. And it's just not, especially for AI, where I think pre-ChatGPT, the publication rate was once every 30 seconds. So it's it's not going to cut it to move at that pace anymore. So I think that needs to be changed without a doubt. And I know that there are efforts in the government to change that. But lastly, I think that opening our doors to kind of what was said earlier about the challenge problems that we face, to kind of give that, to avoid the horizon effect of our own efforts as engineers and scientists and et cetera. We don't want the horizon effect where we engineer something and it's great, and then what? And then what comes of it, right? So I think that could be a really good, that's something I'm personally in my work working toward, is to try to hit these grand challenges together. So
maybe one last quick question, because I would be remiss not to ask about open source AI. How can that be a game changer, and how can we create better policy around that?
Well, I'm not super literate in the policy area of things. Okay. So, I truly believe in open sourcing to the core. I don't think you can really fight against it, really, in my opinion. I think that it's the masses of researchers in the world are going to always outrun certain kinds of methods of functioning. You look at so in any case, I think that with policy, I don't know, I don't want to comment too much on policy, not because it's just I don't know much about that. I do know that there's a lot of issues in AI with bias and training for machine learning constructs, but some of our AI has nothing to do with data, right? Some of our AI that we develop is there are certain kinds of mechanisms that they're not as heavily data driven as machine learning, so you don't face that as much. So yeah, I think that's a really challenging problem that I personally am not involved with right now, because there's not a ton of that in space telemetry data. So yeah.
I everyone, we should thank our expert here. And you don't have to do this before we switch, but do you have any questions for the audience to be thinking about that could spark some messaging, innovation? What should they be thinking about to help build this movement towards a more equitable, space AI, support NASA? How could they give us data that would support you?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I'm always curious about is just, I think people's perception of NASA, where I've lived it, where I work here now and I love it so much. And just, I guess if there's things that, if there's anything based on what I've said that you think I should know or we should know, because right now we are on the precipice of some changes in the government, especially with what's going on in AI. So I don't really know exactly if there's a specific question, but just is there any comments that you all have that you want to bring up to me while I'm really, really listening?
Yeah, a bit of a question. Phrasing it is tricky. I'm just going to dive in. I worked internationally for 15 years in 4 countries, 2 of them in Asia, 2 of them in Europe. I'm a scientist by training. I was at JPL the night of the first moon landing with men in the middle.
So jealous.
And particularly in East Asia, where I spent over 10 years of my life, international property theft was gigantic. And the idea of open sourcing, where other people can see what we develop, regardless of how much it costs to do that, makes me uncomfortable. And I don't want to go into that in this forum, because I don't know most of you guys either. But international security is real, and the consequences are gigantic if it's done badly. And I'm wondering how you reconcile that with some of the
Yeah.
other issues. That's
So
the best I can do.
there's a lot of there's a lot of things we do that like are not even close to like sensitive. So like for example, the architecture I'm open sourcing, it's already out there because I used it in my PhD. Like I use it for my robots and now I'm using it. And so like some of the things we have at NASA are already open source. So like Core Flight System, which is a like an open source architecture for small sats, is open source. I'm not saying we need to open source everything because I agree national security is definitely 100% a real thing. I just think that like what I notice happens when we don't think this way is like a lot of our internal architectures just like get spun up. They're not at industry standard. They're not tested. They're not like on that agile kind of development cycle. And then they just die. So it's like, I think with CFS specifically, I know that CFS, they intentionally open sourced it because they knew that we didn't, as the government, like we are resource constrained. And like sometimes there are certain technologies, especially for innovation and like that we actually putting it out in the community like the rest of the industry does, like is very possible. So yeah, that's totally separate of the national security thing. Believe me, I just went through like export control and my stuff, but like there are ways that we can innovate that we're already doing, and open sourcing it will like almost keep a certain level of like tightness to our code. So yeah.
Before we get into other questions, I'm going to bring the questions back to the panel. So I don't want to disregard questions asked, but I just want to switch it up here. And again, one more round of applause before she comes back up. Jordan, you want to come on up here? Thank you for joining us. Yeah, for sure. Jordan is amazing in a lot of different ways as an astropreneur, and I want to give him the opportunity to explain to you what he's doing in the industry. And also, could you kind of give us this context, the same context of like, how did you get here? What led you to kind of into the role you are now at SpaceRig? And also making sure that, what need are you fulfilling? And we can dive more into it, but let's start there.
Yeah, happy to, thanks. So I'm at SpaceRig. We're a brand new company starting up here. We're mostly located here in the Cambridge area. And actually, some of us are geographically diverse, although the guy who usually sits in Edinburgh is over here. So we've even brought him in here for the week. But we're really focused on data mobility. So small satellites are traditionally pretty hampered by their ability to move data off of the satellite. The gentleman from Planet would certainly agree with that. They've done a lot of absolutely phenomenal RF engineering at Planet to be able to move as much data as they have. And they still, for all intents and purposes, I'm sure, would like to move more data. So we're looking in the optical domain using lasers to be able to move data. There's a lot of reasons it's really tough on small satellites, but once we crack this, and we're working with Professor Carrie Collier here from MIT, once we can crack this, then we can start to bring small satellites into the cloud. And if you think about the value of your cell phone, it's a really nice little camera, it's a pretty great little processor, a nice battery, it connects to the cloud. That's where all the magic happens. You can get freshly trained algorithms, you can store massive amounts of data. Everything that you think of as functionally useful for your cell phone almost certainly happens in the cloud, at least in some part. So we're working really hard to be able to bring these smaller satellites into an ecosystem such as that, like your cell phone uses in 4 and 5G all the time, bring that into the cloud. And then the other side of that is once you can move a lot of different data, there are companies and there are agencies that are doing visible data such as Planet. There are companies and agencies that are flying radar satellites, synthetic aperture radar. You can take high resolution. They're not color, but they're 3-dimensional pictures, and they don't care about clouds, which is another great thing. And they don't care about whether it's day or night. Lots of different types of data. And once we can start moving more of it down to the ground, that data needs to have a home. And so we're really trying to leverage the recent explosion in artificial intelligence, especially in the machine learning world, a subset of that, to try to make that data more generally applicable and also more approachable to people. So for a very long time, Landsat goes back to the 1970s. Various different governments and organizations have been doing things since even before then. That data has lived in an ivory tower somewhere. And we want to try to help get that data out into the world. And we want to try to get multiple different types of data out into the world to see what all the smart people can do with it. And that's really exciting for me.
Just for inspiration purposes, like the range of data sets that, SpaceRig could be combining with the right infrastructure and partnerships, what types of data sets can you capture that will help make an impact?
Yeah, so Really pretty much anything that's being taken in space right now. So we're working with a lot of the data it's technically free. You go to NASA and the data is free. Same thing with the ESA, the Europeans, Japanese, JAXA, CARI, the South Koreans, monetarily free. But there's a lot of opportunity cost to actually trying to make that data behave. They're stored in different ways. The APIs, the interfaces, they're very difficult to maintain. Patrick does a lot of our work with the APIs, and he's back there nodding and bemoaning how hard that is. So we're working to streamline that. We're also working with different private partnerships with different companies. Those data range from relatively high resolution color imagery. You can get resolution from Maxar that's about 30 centimeters, so you can see like a manhole cover. Planets. I heard a podcast, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is the original goal of the system Planet was to be able to resolve a fairly typical tree, the canopy of that tree. Now, Planet can take a picture of every tree on the planet every day. That's an enormous amount of data. There's a lot of trees on the planet. So there's high resolution visible imagery. There's low resolution visible imagery where geosynchronous satellites, you can get an image about every 20 minutes of the whole planet, with the exception of the North and South Pole. But it's pretty low resolution, so it tells you different things. You can watch different patterns happen and changes happen from geostationary as you compared to what you can with the satellites that are closer and taking high resolution photos.
So that's really beneficial because we just don't have enough people on Earth to collect that data themselves.
100%. And so when you start thinking about industries that can use these data, we're really working on trying to get into the workflows of these folks. You mentioned farmers earlier. Most farmers, they're exceedingly practical. They're usually very deep experts in things that are very much not satellites. And they have their own degrees of expertise, and they're very practical. And if it's not useful to them, they're probably not going to use it as a tool. If that tool is especially is satellite data. So we're really working to get into these workflows. But once we get there, and I say we royally, because we're trying to get at SpaceX, we're trying to get data out to all the smart people that are out there. Once industry gets to the point where they can actually start integrating these data into all these other workflows, because satellite data is already there, GPS, right, Google Maps, it's already there. You just never think about it. Banks all run off of the timing signal from GPS constellations. Nobody thinks about it because it's in the workflow. Once that happens, you can start to measure things all over the world. So whether it's methane emissions from an energy system, whether it's the health of a crop, you're looking for rainforest deforestation, you can measure those anywhere in the world, and it's a lot cheaper than hiring, say, a team of field biologists to go out and sample, each of the different areas you care about. So you can get a global perspective with enough resolution to count the trees quite literally from space. And so that's something that's very exciting to me.
So it's also a huge business benefit for folks to collect more data using less manpower.
Absolutely. And not only will it help people do things more efficiently using less manpower, it'll start to help people do things that they couldn't do before. So if you look at the insurance industry, they might be making, their claims adjusters or their actuaries might be making assessments based off of flood maps. When was the last time those flood maps were updated, right? So these radar payloads, especially also from visible imagery, but it turns out that floods and clouds correlate. So with the radar payload, you can see through the clouds, you can see how far did those floods actually progress. Actually, not how far did somebody remember they were, and then you have to go out and try to measure it. You can actually see every day, every couple of days, how far the floodwaters progress when they recede. So insurance can start to do things that they could never do before. Agriculture can start to reduce the use of agrochemicals because they can see when their crops actually need it, before and after treatments of fertilizers or other pesticides, things like that. So there's going to be value that's unique to each industry vertical, but can be, once we figure out how to do that, we can do it globally without having to have an enormous amount of manpower.
Another industry would be even financial accounting. The 1933 Financial Security Acts were set up in this very minimalist standard of how we keep track of our accounting systems. You were mentioning how those need to be updated in a lot of different ways. And personally, I know the Global Reporting Initiative is doing a lot of work in that space, but how can your data help impact that space as well?
Yeah, so one of my mentors, really, I was going to say colleagues, but he's definitely a mentor of mine, is helping to stand up the impacts-weighted accounts initiative. And so he's an accountant. Apparently, you can get a PhD in accounting. That's a thing, and they're working on really interesting problems, because accounting, as you typically think about it, is how much money did you make last year, right? How much money did I make last quarter? How much do I expect to make next quarter? It doesn't make any mention of what other impacts might company have on the people that work for us or the people that are impacted by us. So economists call these negative externalities or positive externalities. What external effects did your firm have on the world that you live in? And these are things that are intrinsically very difficult to measure. But if you think about it, economic accounting isn't trivial to mention either. And as you mentioned, the Securities Exchange Acts, I believe it was 1931, 1933, somewhere in there, that invented the modern accounting system. So we think of this as like this old time, it's been around for forever. It's not even around 100 years that we've been doing bottom line accounting. And so that was a great first pass. It put all these firms on even footing for some things, but it makes absolutely no mention on what are the impacts that those firms are having on the ecology, on the environmental, social governance issues that are becoming, they're very in vogue to talk about right now, and everybody's excited to find ways to make meaningful positive impact. But if you can't quantify it, if you can't measure it, how do you know if what you're doing works or is worth doing in the first place? And so I'm not in any way saying satellites are going to solve all of that, but the global scale of the types of measurements that one can make with these assets that are in space can certainly be a part of that puzzle. And that's going to have enormous economic and societal impacts, I think.
One of our first guests on the show, Bob Massey, was talking to me about how Al Gore is doing like a very smaller scale of what you're building. And the data that I saw is like, if companies have data on their global greenhouse gas emissions and other metrics, they're 80% more likely to actually create policy for change. So the data is such a huge component to measure and then create policy and then hold accountable to that policy. It's a definitely trend, hopefully as a society, in the right direction. I'd be remiss to also not talk about, for inspiration, because we have entrepreneurs in the audience, the space race and the evolution of new technology that wasn't always intended from that. Like, could you touch on kind of the push towards the moon in the first place, and what technology came out of that could hopefully inspire some other entrepreneurs in the audience?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to work here at Draper in Cambridge. So they were part of the space race. They did the guidance computers, the navigation, and all of that. Still to this day, they carry a lot of that forward. A lot of fantastic technology that came out of that. The way that you can control these satellites, the way you can rendezvous them and whatnot. And then when you dive further into the space race, it actually became about beating the Russians. We wanted to beat the Russians. We were locked in the Cold War. We wanted to demonstrate that we had, technological prowess. So over the Russians, and they beat us with Sputnik, and all of this. This was great. The near-term driving factors were beating the Russians to get to the moon, but Neil Armstrong's boots on the moon. And the superficial impacts of that are, we have X, the moonshot factory. We have, it's entered the lexicon as taking a big swing at doing something very, very inspiring. But the actual impacts are significantly bigger than making a moonshot or putting boots on the moon. As impressive and awe-inspiring, and the reason I'm in aerospace as that is, the actual impacts, one could certainly make the argument, and several authors do, that the semiconductor industry emerged from the Apollo program. So just down the road here at MIT, Draper was still part of MIT, just for a little bit of the history there. They were tasked by NASA, James Webb at the time, who's now, we've got his telescope is up there. James Webb was one of the guys that helped stand up NASA. And he said, we need to get to the moon. And the folks at MIT thought they could figure out how to build a computer, but it wasn't low power enough. It wasn't low enough swap, as we call it, size, weight, and power, with the current technologies at the time. But there was this kind of harebrained technology that the semiconductors that were coming out, IBM, I think, invented them, but they were thousands of times too expensive and they're very low reliability. So MIT actually drove the manufacturers of these semiconductors to make so many of them. I think 80% of the semiconductors made in the US at that time were going to Kendall Square. And they drove the reliability up and the price down to the point where the rest of the economic engines could actually take those in as new technologies that were now commercially viable. By the time Apollo launched, they were using very outdated semiconductors because the industry had jumped onto Moore's law and really taken off from there. So a lot of what we use today and we take for granted today, one could certainly make an argument that part of it, at least, can be traced back to the Apollo program. And as Blair's going to talk next about these really big ideas and huge ambitious goals, the near-term, obvious to the casual observer effects of achieving those goals, they might be great. But there's 7 billion people on this planet. Most of them don't do anything with space. A lot of them are very intelligent. And once the technology starts to get out to those other 7 billion people outside of the space industry, it's going to be really exciting to see where that goes.
That's a beautiful way to pull this segment together. I'm super excited for that, and that's a huge reason why we're having this panel together and everyone's here. I would be remiss to not let you ask the audience anything. You don't have to now, but I think how can they help you? How can they help Space Rate?
So one of the things that I see two things that are challenges, and one is a little bit frustrating. The term rocket science. I hate it. Absolutely. Rocket science is hard, sure. So is biology, so is artificial intelligence, so is medicine, so is basically anything worth doing. But rocket science has these artificial barriers. That term itself, people use it colloquially. Oh, it's not rocket science, you should be able to do it. As if you shouldn't be able to do rocket science. So I really wish people would stop using that term. It kills me. But then the other side of that is I wish people would start thinking in their daily lives, what is it your firm does, whether it's aerospace or not? Are you dealing with disparate assets? Maybe you're in the energy sector and you've got hundreds of thousands of acres and you need to monitor change, whether it's crops or your location of devices. A friend of mine here from South Africa has talked to me in the past about how difficult it is to monitor hard assets that are owned across that continent. It's absolutely enormous. And a lot of the places are very austere. So think about what are the things that you do in your daily life that would be made easier if you could take, step back, literally launch back, and take a holistic picture of what is your company doing, what is your supply chain, what is your value chain, and how would you benefit from that high level picture. And if there's anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear them, and then I can give you my business card later. But that's aerospace needs to not be on a pedestal. It's on a pedestal. It's been there. It was part of the Cold War. That's great. Cold War was over a long time ago. There are a lot of fields that when they start bringing aerospace as a component, as a part of what they do, they're going to be better for it. Aerospace is going to be better for it. Medicine, ecology, all of these things that we do that are very human and very local are going to be a lot better for it once aerospace is seen as a component rather than some ideal that one puts on a pedestal. And most people say Apollo, and you think about Tom Hanks, right? They're not thinking about the semiconductor.
I love that you said that because, as the person who helped Tom, put all of this together, I think part of it really is just humanizing not only the space industry, but the people who work in the space industry. I think that prior to actually, working with Blair and other spacepreneurs or just people in general, I did have this very mindset of oh, it's not rocket science. But in reality, it's literally that, we're all knowledgeable about one thing and we're not knowledgeable about another thing. But it's that human aspect, that collaborative effort that really makes all the things work. And so I think that that's what we really need to be working towards, is how do we put all of these things collaboratively together? Because it's all disparate puzzle pieces. Now we just got to put them together.
The data can help us.
And data can help us.
The value of a puzzle doesn't occur, the picture doesn't occur until all the pieces are there. So the value of the puzzle is more than the pieces themselves. And there's a lot of industries based around that same thing. Value can be an emergent property of a system. And once we start to bring in new AI is one of them, remote sensing data is another, there's a lot of value that I expect will be emerging in the next 5 years or so. It's a very exciting time.
Oh, I'm fired up. We'll take you off the pedestal, just like the phrase, We'll welcome Blair up, the astropreneur himself.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. So Blair, help introduce yourself to the audience. Can you talk about what you're doing with Lunar Station and the aha moments that led you to feel this need and lead you on this journey?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Blair DeWitt, CEO and founder of Lunar Station. Everyone should be familiar with Earth mapping or geospatial, and the analytics of that data is geospatial. You can't say that on the moon, so it's selenospatial. And so our platform, Moon Hacker, does advanced analytics for private and government agencies as it relates to the moon. The platform is open enough that other industries can come in and participate, like mining industry, legal and policy, and it has opportunity to help startups and heritage organizations better understand the moon. When we started the company here, over there, we recognized that there was a problem with understanding the moon, not from planetary science perspective, but from the rate of data generation and understanding. And so we initially organized to say, well, what we need to do is increase the rate of data generation, which would improve understanding of the moon. When we started going to market and talking with folks about, okay, what is it about the moon you need to better understand? And they said, well, we actually need to understand the data that's already been generated. We don't need more data just to pile up. And we weren't ready for that. And so we pivoted from putting a constellation around the moon to really driving in and bringing best practices as far as analytics and taking what the geospatial folks had started enhancing on and tying it to another fixed body in space.
To bring us into the civic side of things, you've talked about how a blank mindset is needed when exiting Earth. Could you explain that concept so that we can, to a degree, have this blank slate when building the rest of the conversation?
Definitely. So I'm a lunatic. I'm not alone. There's a lot of lunatics out there. And when we get together, either at the Moon Village Association or the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group or the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, it's a lot of fun because you have a lot of nerds together thinking about this new continent that we have that's blank. There's nothing there. I mean, yeah, there's Saturn stage 3 boosters and there's some LEMs and Lord knows what the hell hit the moon about a year ago. We're still trying to figure that out. But for the most part, we have this really unique opportunity that it's a blank continent for us, for the world. So what should that continent look like? Knowing what we know, all the mistakes, all the great things that we've done here, how do we pull that understanding together and take the best of that and apply it to this new continent that we have?
The intentionality behind how we even phrase our setup there was really inspiring when you talked to me about the habitability concept versus colonization concept, which comes with a lot of exploitive pain that has been experienced on Earth. Can you talk about the intentionality behind why habitability is the term your team and others are using?
Absolutely. This comes to our basic operating system, and that it really does break down to lenses and frames. How you see something predicates your response to something. And so the best way to look at this blank slate is really with fresh lenses and a fresh frame. And one of the worst things to do is to use a old, outdated smear of a word called colonization and put that to something new. So what would be the new frame and lens that we would use in its habitation? And if we think about habitation, not colonization, the moon's a much brighter place to be. And so applying those rudimentary core human operating system parameters allows us to really see the moon in the way it should be seen. And that is a great place to habitate.
When we think of how, this 8th continent could potentially benefit the 7 billion people here, how can we set up structures and potentially use resources there that would benefit the people here?
Absolutely. And that's
why, again, when you think about framing and the lenses you use, when you think about the moon as our next continent, that invokes a lot of intrigue and understanding that it is a repository of resources that we will need to succeed. Everywhere it's finite. It's finite here, it's finite on the moon, it's finite on Mars. Our opportunity as a species, and to be slightly better than dinosaurs, is to go and grow the amount of resources we have available to us and how we utilize them. And so when we think about all the different aspects of human life, there are so many things we're dependent on. That's why we've thrived as a species, almost to our own detriment. Now, there's two outcomes to that, just logically. Just don't go anywhere, stay here, and Earth, in side note, we don't have to save the Earth. She's gonna be fine. We have to save our spot on here. Let's get that straight. Save the Earth, yeah, she's fine. The only way we can do that is either less of us, that sucks, right? Or more places for us to go. That's it. So we better get good at going other places because the alternative choices are horrific.
In order to truly set up, the eighth continent, we need this data infrastructure highway almost to make sure that we're capturing, that we can learn when the moon is impacted by whatever, and actually be able to assess that. I'm learning this now. How do we set up that infrastructure? What does that look like? And also, how does it balance that public-private partnership to a degree?
How much time do I have? Sweet. So the way the moon is right now is very much in a static state. There's one National Space Agency that's actually done some very aggressive implementation of devices on the surface and around, and that's China. When you look at the signers of the Artemis Accord, there's this notion that we'll be able to go and catch up, but we haven't yet. We have one reconnaissance satellite that's way past mission life. It's done 56,000 orbits this month. And that's a good data set, but it's using technology that was sent before the iPhone was in the market. So it's taken a few hits from all the meteorite showers that we go through and the moon goes through. And so there has to be more going. And fortunately, recently, especially with the new platform, and this goes back to one of those aha moments. Back when I was at NASA 30 years ago, Isaac Goddard, so we were doing Hubble processing and repair planning, and we were designing Space Station Freedom, right? And then I got drawn into Silicon Valley. Wow, what a ride. A couple decades later, I'm kind of like, all right, so high tech for high tech, that's been fun. I'd like to think about what's next, and my midlife crisis involved tuition payments over there. I couldn't believe I was accepted, but since I was, why not? And part of Sloan makes you go out to all the different labs and get to know the doctoral managers of the labs. I was going around to a bunch of different ones, and through the course of my first year, I kept finding myself back at Vassar Street going through the space labs. And I was pissed because while I was in Silicon Valley and doing all these things in core infrastructure and big data problems, I was watching NASA TV. And great, that's awesome. I know all the NASA stuff that's going on. I walk into Carrie's lab, and there are these little boxes like, what the hell's this? They're like, oh, it's a CubeSat. I'm like, son of a bitch, that's amazing. And because basically the standardized structure
and a commercialization capability because it's standardized, just like the PC business. As the PCs got standardized and you had a common PCI board and everyone could build to it and it all works because of the interfacing, like, wow, why didn't SATV cover that? And that was an aha moment, like, oh, I got to get back into this because now it's exciting. Now it's commercial. Now there's a lot of opportunities. I looked at LEO and realized that the next economic zone was lunar economy. And then the next decision point was, do I try and go back to NASA with this understanding that the moon's the next economic zone, or do I set up something that's private and privately funded? And unfortunately for me, 93 was a rough year for government employees because the will of the taxpayer really shifted a lot of budgets. I was out of the Marine Corps. I had to work at, wow, that sounded bad. I had an opportunity to work at NASA as a temporary duty station, but that only has a finite amount of time. So I saw will of the taxpayer in a negative way, and that's shifting. And I said, well, what if I went and got private capital? Great, it's ride or die. Like, I can't go to my investors and say, hey, remember all that moon stuff? What about Saturn? No. What about Mars? What about, no. You said the moon or die. Like, that's how private capital works. Other than that, you get a lot of latitude. But your core mission and vision, like, you can't pivot on that. And so that's what really drew me to the private sector, was a commitment in funding.
We'll talk more about kind of funding models together, but with the especially in the U.S. national space, the limit of public capital for long-term projects is frustrating, and you just shared your experience. So private capital is leading the charge in our country to go to the moon, and ultimately there'll be resources collected by those private firms. Could you help us from a civic perspective gain a mindset into, there's a fear that, and a question from the chat of like, these resources will be limited to a few people, So but how does your messaging counter that? How do you talk about what the future of these resources that are going to be important to our species will be consumed? And also, how can we at least start to think through an equitable lens of that?
Right. And it's a great question. It's a great concern that if there was a small puddle of water on the moon and a private firm happened to capture that frozen puddle, well, that would be terrible. The fact is there's 60 trillion cubic meters of water. So there's enough for everybody. Private enterprise, government agencies, not-for-profits, it's a whole continent. And the resources actually are well distributed. Everyone's focused on the southern polar region, but there are permanently shadowed regions in the North Pole. So although there's a certain zeitgeist about the southern pole, there's just as many opportunities in the northern pole. There are all sorts of places that water collects, and other volatiles, and there's a mechanism in the solar system. When I was in junior high, the dark ages, we thought space was empty. Like, empty. There's nothing there. Yeah, there's these rocks floating around and this and that. There's water everywhere. It free floats, it gathers, there's mechanisms that make it, protons from the sun colliding. There's a whole engine to produce the resources. It isn't just a depositional. There is a manufacturing mechanism to it. And that opens up a world or a solar system of opportunities. And because that happens, and we haven't messed with the moon for 4 billion years, there are areas of interest, whether you're looking for rare earth minerals, things that make batteries, things that make high performance compute chips. There's water, other volatiles that are important. Helium-3 has a better chance of surviving on the moon than it does here. So we can either spend a lot of energy artificially creating it here, or we can go and find it out in space where it's part of the mechanism of creation.
Another quick question for the chat, maybe like one or two, and then we'll get to the panel. And you've mentioned this, so this is why VCC, thank you for the question. What type of currency would work from a universal perspective? And I think that
I love this question too. I really do. All right. So I don't like cryptocurrency. Right. I think that's unregulated. I think it's dangerous. I don't like black markets. It rewards poor performers. So here in Massachusetts, gambling is legalized. Marijuana is legalized. That's taking a lot of money out of dark operators. Love it. What I don't like is introducing another dark area of the economy. And unfortunately for crypto, that's a problem. But the technology under it, I really love. And I think blockchain is really going to be the accounting catalog of the future. And it can go off world and survive. Because if I create a liquid oxygen store on the surface of the moon, and I have a blockchain ledger tied to it, I have chain of custody, unbreakable, I can transfer, and it gets all accounted. Now the currency, it's not gonna be Dogecoin. Sorry, Elon.
Kind of last question again before the panel is, you've led a lot of emerging technologies to market for the betterment of humanity as a whole. What have you learned from building those types of teams, that the entrepreneurs in the audience could benefit from?
Yeah, so when I was at EMC, I was in the Emerging Technology Center. We would take experimental technology and unleash it to trusted clients and hold our breath. And it was really interesting. Most of the large corporations have an Emerging Technology Center, and they are risk averse or risk comfortable because there's so much of the normal operation doesn't want to disrupt. So you need a specialized group of people that are okay failing. And my wife will tell you, I fail constantly. I'm okay with it, because I'll always try. And that's what emerging technology, that's what the spirit of the teams I build is. Don't be afraid to try. You may fail, you may succeed. We don't know till you try.
That's the whole point of us, hopefully, that you all feel in this audience. We're trying to talk about these things so that we can create a better society. And this is an experiment by itself, this forum and structure. So thank you for your participation. I know that you kind of have a question that could spark our panel's conversation a little bit, but just like audience, feel free to participate in Blair's kind of little exercise here.
Yeah, so you can answer multiple times, but by a show of hands, if you could go to low Earth orbit, would you? Okay. By show of hands, if you could go to the moon and come back, would you? Okay. If you could go to Mars and come back, would you?
Well, is this making the assumption that we're gonna come back?
Yeah. Well, okay, so the level of participation in this audience is on the top end of the curve. When I talk with larger groups, majority of hands go to Leo. It's safe space for us. The moon, about 50%. Mars, like 10%. So I think what we're seeing, and I've asked this question since the beginning because it was part of like, okay, if I'm forming this entity, what are we doing here? And there was a lot of discussion about Mars versus the moon. And I see consistently at events, more and more people are comfortable going places in space. And I think that's just awesome.
Oh, I love that. So you stay up here, Blair. Let's welcome everybody up, Thank you again for that great segment. I was very inspired. You guys are just all amazing in very complimentary ways. So I'm grateful that Cynthia helped create this panel. So thank you. So I think that a good theme that everyone's talked on is this partnership model, public-private consortium, and anyone can feel free to dive in first. But how do we continue to build on that? How is there examples out there that you see as really successful? How can we inspire our audience to think through the future is partnership?
Well, we have a great practicum for that. And that is the Commercial Lunar Payload Service, CLPS. I really like it because
you can either work for NASA or not. But with CLPS, NASA's just a customer. And with the commercial lunar payload service, NASA says, hey, I got this thing. You have a lander. I'm going to pay you to take this thing to the surface of the moon. I'm not running your mission. We're not in your hair. You don't have to tell us what's in the black box. You have to get my payload to the surface. And here's some money. Awesome. Wall Street loves that. The entrepreneurs love that. And the PIs love it. Because they're not waiting for systems like SLS or Vulcan or, these government rocket things. They can actually just hitch a ride. And I think when NASA and therefore the US government is a customer to an aerospace firm, that's the optimum model. Just my opinion.
I respect your opinion. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else, have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. Eclipse is a really great example of a great program. And I think that when we look at the progression over the last 50, 75 years, especially space is a really stark example. It's not the only one, but it's a very stark example of it. Government spending, government leadership is invaluable in certain contexts and in the way in other contexts. And so as soon as a market emerges where a company in a free market economy like we have is going to be able to get out and do what they do and optimize things, then the government needs to say, that's great, let me support you, and then get out of the way. But those companies tend to get stuck. They tend to get stuck on local optima. I know there's people that do a lot of optimizations here. And so they're going to optimize for their widget, and it's too expensive to build a whole new type of widget and go try a new market. But we can make a lot of money in this widget, so we'll just make the widget cheaper, lighter, faster, better, whatever. The government can step back and say, you know what, 30 years from now, 20 years from now, we want to be over here. This is where we are today. This is where we're going to go. So they can actually implement longer term planning. And that, where there is not yet a market, that's where I think the government leadership really shines. That transition, though, is tricky. And that transition CLPS, commercial lunar payload service, that loan launch provider service, that one, CLPS is a great example of a successful transition of that. They handed off the LEO, getting you right up to the low Earth orbit pretty effectively. And now if you look at what is SpaceX doing with the price points, right? They're optimizing on their business model. They're making revenue. They're making things cheaper, faster, better. Elon Musk, they happen to have this guy who's got like $100 billion and he buys things like Twitter. So they're a bit of an anomaly because he can also say, yeah, and I want to go to Mars. But a typical, the average billionaire doesn't have enough money to say, you know what, screw it, let's start our own space program. So the typical company that isn't necessarily reflected in SpaceX, even though a lot of the returns, the near term, closer to home returns are.
It's I think that one of the challenges is that being a government agency, you still are part of the government. So everything that applies to FBI or whatever, OPM, it just spans everybody. And it's tough because we're really different. NASA's especially really different, honestly, out of the other, the intel community or whatever. So I think it's hard because there's so many days where my true answer to your question is I'm working on it, but there's so many days where I realize there are things set up. Some of them really do make a lot of sense and some of them definitely don't. But it's I'm a software engineer, so it's trying to get some system written in COBOL to be all of a sudden written in Python. It's just really hard. But I think that one of the things I've been working on is how do we break the typical procurement model? Because first of all, I don't think that we're any of in the government, it's hard because we are this big moving machine. I don't know if we're even organized enough to figure out what procurement we actually need, right? Because we do have a wider aperture for some of these science missions and stuff, but it is more of a wider aperture. You were saying with lunar, you're sticking with lunar. It's we do still have this wider aperture that we operate in, and sometimes it's challenging. But I think if we break the procurement model and try to be more acknowledge that a lot of people outside of our doors are doing things better than us, instead of having everybody just kind of be squished against the glass, watching NASA or doing a little thing, following the moving target, being true partners where it's hey, you guys are helping us just as much as we're helping you. The other thing too is I think that the government, there's a lot of even being a civil servant myself, you're always trying to find more funding. I think sometimes when people approach me, they think I'm gonna literally like write a check that's a joke. I like like it's just so hard because like there's no like I'm also competing for that money too. So it's like I think that like I do think that like that true partnership model, like even if entities are coming to the table all separately with their own funding and then like together pitching toward like larger umbrella sources outside of NASA could really help. Because then what I think it provides is like the what's in it for me for like the agency. Like and like this is again, I know I keep saying it, but I just want to be really sensitive to the fact this isn't like a NASA opinion. This is just personally my opinion. It's like and you see this everywhere, like you mentioned being at Sloan, like academia is like that too, like, right? So how can we do it better in academia than try that again in space, please, and then maybe something will happen better.
One of my main thoughts is we need to make the US national government function better to a degree. Because you look at the EU and some of the startups that they have there, are almost the opposite, where they've gotten maybe some seed funding from private, but public is funding them for 5 to 10 years without question, not stifling their innovation. So, it's a lot. So I want to not just force, how do we change the US government upon your team here, you three here. How can we look to other models of funding that are innovative? Like a question that I've been trickling around in my mind is the concept of competition. Are there any competitions out there that could yield more innovations as funding opportunities? And maybe we could run those competitions publicly?
Well, funny you mentioned that. Last year, and I don't know if it's completely done, but there was a NASA competition for food innovators to see essentially like who could grow or who could produce food for these Mars missions because they're going to take about 3 years. And so you need to be able to feed and clothe these astronauts for 3 years. And so there actually was a deep space food challenge. There we go.
It's a great example. Does that spark anything of what you three have seen or heard of, or?
Well, to Jordan's point, I mean, there are organizations that take a look at, okay, how are we going to go about this? And they set up to be a government grant shop, which takes a lot of resources and energy. Get your SBIR phase ones, turn them into SBIR phase twos. But even the government acknowledges, then you hit the canyon of death because nobody makes it to phase 3. Right.
Sound like a model for success.
Actually, for really weird, quirky technology, phase 1s are very cool in what they're designed for, but not all government phase 1s. So just a quick disclosure, we've done more work with DoD than NASA. So when I talk about the SBIR phases, I'm really anchored in the
differences.
Than the NASA SBIRs. So you have to know those structures. I mean, it's a whole ecosystem. Or the other side is you go and you do this deal, you do that deal, you do this deal, and you start getting up your commercial chops. And then government says, oh my God, how did this get to TRL 9 already? I wasn't filling out SBIRs. So it'd be an extreme, but those are the cases. And the problem is if you're so successful in commercial, there's a fear on the government side, like, well, everyone has access to this. What am I getting special? And you're like, I don't know how to answer that. So there are those tensions, but the smart organizations can figure out how to leverage some of that innovation. Small fund. I mean, so the DoD recalibrated, it's like $50K for SBIR phase 1. NASA it's still 150. So there's all these different levels too, but that money goes pretty far when you're creating something new and you need someone to go, oh hell, I'll try that. So
Well, I don't have much to say except like the DoD budget versus NASA budget like is different.
Yeah, the amount of competition is different too.
No, I know. I'm just saying, like, I'm not, believe me, once again.
Yeah.
But I always have said that too, like with the SBIR model, like trying to do some more innovation. It's like, oh my God, like, so for me being like really trying to stay relevant with AI, I'm like, I can't wait that long to work with people, like I really can't.
Yeah.
So it's funny just hearing like entrepreneurs like saying things that are like things I've thought or felt or like whatever is kind of refreshing.
But
Um,
to Tom's point, one of our partners that embed our analytic engine in their offering, they're part of the ESA incubator. ESA's running an incubator and has all these startups going through it.
Mhm.
What they don't have is a lot of private capital yet. But the interesting thing is that in the European market, that exits out of the ESA incubator have a higher probability of getting private placement than those that didn't go through that. So it's fascinating to see what's going on across the pond.
Different systems. I've talked to European entrepreneurs that just salivate over the SBIR program. And so, like they're very different systems and they work differently. But I think this is another example of when should the government be involved, when shouldn't it? So when you sit down with someone in private equity, first thing they're going to ask, maybe if they ask your name, it's the second thing. When are you going to be EBITDA positive? When are you going to be earnings positive? Earnings before interest and taxes, depreciation taxes. So that's what they're concerned with because that's their business model, right? And they've optimized on that particular thing to be looking at that. The government doesn't have that requirement. They're not, they're writing grants. They're not saying, oh, I need to get my return back and I want 10x in 5 years or 10x in 3 years. It makes it really hard for a space company to compete with a dating app in the private, for real. I've had people say, oh yeah, I don't want to do space hardware because we've got 3 dating apps and that's what we're focused on. And it's like, okay, but this is an example where as you're looking for new and better models, test cases, trial runs, and the culture matters too. So the European culture and approach to risk and government involvement is different from that in the US, the East versus the West versus North versus South. Like they can try different things in different contexts. The governments can afford to see which ones work. And if they're smart about it, they'll be able to do it in a way that's controlled and measurable. And then once they really find something that's going to work and it's going to stick, it's going to probably start to create ecosystems. And then the faster moving private sector is going to kind of impedance match and they'll design puzzle pieces to fit the edges of whatever the government has left. And so this is another example where the handoff is very critical, but the government has the ability to strategically think about it and lead. And then the local optimizers, the people in private capital and the private markets are going to find ways to do things that are of a different flavor.
I have a few ideas on how we can make our national government function better. That we'll save for another show. But you brought up ecosystems, and I feel like because we're in Kendall Square, it'd be remiss not to talk about why is this ecosystem so special? Why are we having a space night here? Why are you 3 building your space ventures and space careers here in Cambridge?
I'll just say, I think I'm like the only person I got her with a PhD in AI, so that's why I need help. Yeah.
If you were to recruit help, would you pitch to them that this is the place where help should come?
Well, so I grew up here, first of all. But like Massachusetts or New England region has the highest concentration of academic institutions and like innovative companies overlaid in the area. We also have like other, there's all different metrics for different cities, but I know like we have the highest amount of like venture capital coming in and like there's some metrics on patents and such. But like in any case, the value proposition of the academic institutions is the most interesting to me because of being like in the government, it's not so easy to get like the young talent in AI to come to the government to compete with like the salaries and everything like that. So like what my argument is that if we can't get younger people to come to NASA, we have to like bring NASA to younger people. So I really I'm happy that I was, my duty station is here right now because I just being here even tonight, like just getting in my car and coming down to this is just amazing. And so for me, like I think that's kind of why it's like also just the pipeline of like younger employees and just the energy and everything. But like objectively, like there needs to be more AI researchers to support the things we're doing. Like they're like kind of what you had said earlier, like there are real things with the government that are different. It's just, it is what it is and it'll always be that way. There are things that should be the way they are in the government, but I don't think that that's like mutually exclusive from innovation. Kind of what Jordan was saying, like Apollo. I mean, I was thinking of all these spin-offs, right? Like, so yeah, so that's why I'm here. I mean, I also think selfishly, I really like being here, just being from this area. I just think that what we have here is so unique across the country. I'm biased, but like the energy that we have, like the hustle, like that just, I don't know. It's so something that I think that the government could benefit from or like NASA could benefit from. So yeah.
Well, I think when you look at every industry, they have that center of innovation. And what's behind that center of innovation is competition. And therefore, if there's competition, there are winners and losers. But the losers don't stay losers long because they learn their lessons and they get to apply it again and compete again. And so it's that cycle of competition. Whether you win or lose, you got to be a competitor. And when you think about the New York Fashion District or Wall Street, or you go out to LA for movies, you see these clusters in each of the different industries where it's concentrated competition. So your failures aren't catastrophic. You're not the one person in the South Pole that blew up this, that, or the other, right? You're in an area where, okay, that didn't work. Try this again, and let's go this way. And without those concentrations, you won't have competition. And without competition, you can't create those types of environments. Now here in Cambridge, look, our industry is not the favorite child. It's biotech. It's biotech.
True.
So we're in a competition just for attention. Hi, everybody. Glad you're here.
We're the middle children.
Yeah. So even that I love. Like, okay, I'll take you on biotech. I see you. Let's go. Right.
I love that.
Are you
But-
taking on Pfizer? Arm wrestling?
Well, you
That's
know,
a great point, honestly.
I'll take your Pfizer and raise them a Boeing.
So there you go. Yeah. One of the other things about the Boston area, the density of ideas and people that are capable of executing those ideas is fantastic. And just down on the street corner here, Kendall Square, somewhere there's like a post that says, I don't remember which magazine publication it was, but it was labeled the most innovative mile in the world. And it's pretty cool to walk past that. I mean, they're not, arguably they're not wrong. There are other places. Silicon Valley is pretty impressive place too.
It's interesting you say that because that's actually the innovation trail. And so it's a walking trail that was kind of put together by Boston Globe editor Scott Kirstner. And so it spans from Central to Downtown Crossing, and it's a history lesson of innovation within Cambridge and Boston.
I'm definitely gonna have to go walk that trail.
You
This is
absolutely
super
should.
exciting.
They start actually out of CIC. Side note.
The downside to the culture here is we get so absorbed into the tech that oftentimes, and I do this myself, I miss the point, right? And so one of the things that the Bay Area seems to have figured out is and again, going back to the messaging about trying to bring space off the pedestal and make it more human and applicable is, my friends from the Bay Area, they start with people and users and use cases, and we start in laboratories, and I used to do a lot of math, and it was so great that nobody cared. and so I finally, one day I was in this really niche area in nonlinear quantum optics, and then I looked up when there's 8 people in the world that care about this particular formulation, and I don't like them. and so we really have a tendency to get totally wrapped up in our own little thing. And even though it may be, CRISPR, right? Look at CRISPR was in part done here at the Broad, also down in Berkeley and many other places. Enormous world-changing technologies, and if people don't have the wherewithal to look out beyond their lab bench or their marker board or whichever particular rabbit hole they happen to be buried down, then they miss the point.
If I may,
Of course you can.
there's actually a question in the chat that I really appreciate. So you're kind of asking if we can open up and expand our views, essentially. And so from an investment standpoint, to kind of go back to one of our original points, how can we sell space to investors when the entire point of a private investor is to take the least amount of risk as possible? So how can we sell space to people who are clutching their pearls at that?
So John Deere projects $150 billion market opportunity by 2030 in agriculture alone. VCs are going to perk their ears up about that. Another thing you can do is start to make this information and data available. And then you don't have to sell space hardware to sell space, because you can have 3 people in a garage. You get Ivana and her favorite friends in a garage, and they can sit down and
All the time.
they can take these data and combine it with some other data and start to wrap algorithms and provide real value to the people.
So someone who provides this kind of data, how do you make an income? How are you like profiting?
Well, I was listening to him. It's non-trivial. It's
Makes a lot of money.
The challenge is, I think going back to Anna's point, the fundamental blockage is the NASA missions. I think it got the space, they kind of have this haphazard policy that they've created in early 2000s. I think they need to relook at it. They need to reset it fundamentally. Like NASA, there is no reason why they should have their own satellites. They can buy it from like the ecosystem in terms of like other commercial satellites. They can buy the data from there. So it should really start from there. All US governments should take the initiative to buy commercial data, commercial insights. That would actually start the industry. The issue really is this, like the venture capital industry wants highly competitive products. But when you have like free, half-baked free data sources out there, all of a sudden the value is constantly deprecated. So there is like really no room for, like even if you were to create these free insights from free data, it's not valuable too much.
Well, can I just dovetail on that? Because everyone's comments are just feeding and highlighting something about like specific about my center is like that's none of this part is like in our conversations because we're not for profit and we're science for science sake. So like nobody's going to be interested in us like pretty much unless they want to do cool things. No, I'm not saying as an argument. I just want to like highlight it because it's just like.
And I think that that's part of the questioning though, is how can we bring these two worlds together? Because on one hand, it really is people who are passionate about this industry, who are passionate about this work and giving this knowledge. But then there's that gap of getting people to literally and metaphorically buy into it.
I've had conversations with people who like, I'm not going to get into too many details, but like I've noticed like, you know, they say that there's two types of people in this world for all these different things.
Yeah.
Well, I almost feel like there's like two types of people in this world. There's like people who just think space is cool and then people who just don't care. Right. And like there can be converts. Like I would consider myself a convert. Like I literally got my job at NASA because this is like hilarious and I don't even care. Somebody I knew like really liked space and he pissed me off just enough. And I was like, I'm going to get a job at NASA. That's literally, I'm not joking. That is how I got my job. And then I got to Langley and I was like, I had like my Dunkin' Donuts coffee from Boston. I was like, I am in the wrong place. Like, so it's funny because like now that I'm a part of it, first of all, I was like absolutely sold on just the culture of NASA. Like the people, oh my God, they're like such nerds and like it's crazy. And I love being there because I feel so comfortable there. Like especially being like a younger female. Like honestly, for most days, it's like these people are pretty chill. But then I fell in love with space after. So like I've never seen Star Wars. Nope. No Star Trek? Yeah.
We're not friends.
Star
Trek is the hardest.
I want to loop back on there's two types of people in the
Yeah.
world.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm straddled weirdly both. And actually, to your point, like I love. I know. But what you were saying earlier, like one of the things I love so much about working at NASA is like the fact that I consider myself like a pretty approachable, like not what you'd think at NASA, and I like that people are like, oh, like damn, like I could, I guess, work there too. Like I clock in at 9, clock out at 5, usually like clock out at like 10, whatever. But like, you know what I'm saying? So now that's what I'm just trying to say is that it's like, I think that seems like when you enter in like that for-profit world, it's like the business people are like, well, what's in it for you? Where's the money? And it's like, I don't know, you want to be both part of something cool? Like,
But there are ways to license it out. Like NASA can be the purchaser. Like they can buy the data from commercial sources and then license it for like scientific reasons. But I think because they have these missions like Landsat, which itself is like $10 billion investment in itself. Like rather than that, spend it on the ecosystem, buy it from like the ecosystem. I think there needs to be a fundamental reset in the whole policy.
I would say across the board, though, the one industry that really does get underestimated is financial. Like, it's a science, understanding capital, how capital gets accumulated, how it gets allocated, the cost of capital. All of these things are really important in whether you're in the government, out of the government, for profit, not for profit. Remember, not for profit doesn't mean not for revenue. Let's get that straight, right? You still have to understand capital as a science. And those people that don't look beyond their workbench and go into the capital markets, yeah, they get shredded. because you're disrespecting them by not doing your due diligence and understanding cost of capital, capital structures, event horizons. Having a cogent conversation with a prospective investor isn't about how big is the check going to be. It's going to be like, look, I see this company having an event horizon in 5, 6, 7, 12 years. You need to find the capital that wants that kind of event horizon. If you're talking to someone that's looking for a 2-year turnaround, you're not talking, right? You're not having a conversation. So it is a science, and it needs to be respected as a science, and it takes a lot of research and understanding. And why I went to get an MBA was I knew I needed to know the science of capital so that I can implement it smarter and better than I did before. It's kind of an idiot. You know, I could do a lot of things in computers, some things I shouldn't do, right? But capital, it's a whole different world. Yep.
But something to think about is, do you want to promote science or do you want to promote innovation? Two different things. Innovation is entirely different from science. Science can be a researcher doing like science projects for the longest time, creating mathematical models. Innovation probably has to do with.
You're still making a capital structure decision.
But it's mostly tied to people's use case, climate. Like these are like more tangible things is where innovation kicks
Well, a
in.
lot of the climate discussion falls on capital structures. Like it fails. And that's where I think you have to have a blended approach to this. And I think I saw your hand up.
Well, I was going to say, I've lived in both worlds. I went to Caltech as an undergrad. I was at JPL during the first movement, and then I went to Harvard Business School. And as a classmate of mine who went through at the same time, I had him talk to my oldest son, who was a nuclear propulsion officer on submarines for 5 years and was senior at Harvard Business School. I was actually rather negative about the place. My friend Jim Simmons talked to him, and I said, after, what did you tell him? He said, I can't imagine two cultures more antithetical.
More what?
Caltech and Harvard Business
Antithetical.
School. But I ended up a venture capitalist. I was a venture capitalist for 10 years, starting with Citibank in London and then New York. I went to spend some time in Japan, 9 years, and I came back and rejoined venture capital. There is a huge literature, well, not a huge literature. There is a very solid literature on this very culture clash issue, but it is not necessarily well taught. It wasn't really taught at Harvard Business School until about 10 years ago. I know because I worked there. And if you really want to know the answer, read Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. He is based in Silicon Valley. He's been there since the early 90s. He's basically a marketing consultant, who's also a VC. He describes it better than anybody else I know. Then there's Steve Blank, and there's Clay Christensen, for whom I worked, and there's some other guys. But there is truly a clash here, and people who are trained only in the sciences think that theirs is the only valid mission. People who are bankers think that there is the only rational way to look at things. And you've got to square the circle. And squaring the circle is kind of an art. It is rational, but it's not, it doesn't fall in any one camp, but it's very hard to do, and it tears you apart at times. And I've been torn apart repeatedly.
But I mean,
I wanna add something.
you have to.
I wanna add
You
something.
have to
It's
pitch
gone on
to
for
get
a
money.
long
I
time.
know. Well, so I have to say
Yeah.
something interesting just
Sure.
while you mentioned it, because I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
want to highlight this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people in the room might know this. It's like, even within like NASA, right? Like, we have like this clash between scientists and
Sure.
engineers. It's crazy. It's crazy. Like, and if you think about it, like objectively, like, so I'm an engineer. Like, I literally like am an engineer. And so sometimes like people say things to me, and I'm just like, it doesn't compute, and I feel like an idiot, but like sometimes I have to be like, what is the literal thing you're trying to say? And like working with scientists is like, so it's almost like this top down, bottom up thing where it's like, we want to, and I know you guys probably know this, but it's like scientists want to do like everything. They want all the data, and they like, and actually I was a mathematician. So I went to school for math. I had 2 degrees in math. So like I started out as like a kind of like an analytical kind of like non-empiricist or whatever. And then like I moved into like this space of being an AI, which is interesting because machine learning is so empirical, but like, so it's just funny because like even outside of the whole like, well, first of all, you're right. Everything comes down to money, right? So like when you're trying to pitch for like, as an engineer, you always have to at Goddard make sure it's like strategically aligned with the science. So it's like, you have to understand the science. And I'm a mission resilience lead. So I need to know like exactly what I say. I'm like the therapist of engineering, because it's like, what are your problems? Like every subsystem, I need to know propulsion, thermal, like comms, everything I have to know about. So it's just funny how even outside of bridging those disparate worlds, even within our own culture, it's
But every September, it's Fight Club in the government.
like,
Mhm. And that's
You
the type of-
have to, even in the government, you have to pitch value. And you
Yeah.
have to understand the cost versus the benefits and the structures in which you can operate. And it's so just for everyone, whether you're going government, lab, out of lab, into commercial, you have to understand financial structures. It just doesn't happen without it. And that leads us back to the topic you brought us in on.
Messaging.
Civics.
Yes.
Same thing with civics, like how capital is allocated makes a difference in society. And the cost of not allocating versus the cost of allocating it. And what we do domestically here in the city, here in the state, here in the country, here in the world, it all, what we spend money on is what's important.
Our priorities. You know,
Yeah.
budget is a priority list. And I think that we don't necessarily have our priorities in the right place. But my goal of this
We have like
experiment,
300 million priorities here in the States.
true,
Every voter has a
My
priority.
budget is
I think that
$1.
clearly they are well, I won't dive into the priorities as much as the concept of how do we get over this horizon effect? Because I think a lot of it has to do with messaging. You know, like to me, the thing that excites me so much about the concept of a Green New Deal is because it's like, hey, we don't know exactly what that means, but that message, that excites me. It is, we could do this public works program that puts a ton of people to work to transform our energy sector, really combine public-private resources. You know, that's to me comparable to the concept of going to the moon or World War II mobilization. You know, it's like, hey, we have this big goal that we need to like acknowledge. We need to survive as a species. Currently, what we're doing is rapidly destabilizing us. You know, that's why I think this was so exciting for me in the concept of going to the moon is like a unifying concept of, and it's worked in the past. So I guess my question to kind of round us out here is what messaging has worked for you guys to get people excited about your work, to get excited about this future of astropreneurship, and just excited about working together as a species to build a better future?
So I'll have to push back a little bit when you say that, you know, sorting out these societal problems while it's not going to the moon, they're a lot harder. Going to the moon, we had systems with a few thousand parts, maybe 10,000 parts. And there's interfaces between each of those parts and you have to do good systems engineering. We got there with slide rules.
We didn't go to the moon because it was easy.
You're right. This country has 300 million parts, each of which have some unknowable amount of degrees of freedom, and there's 7 billion of them on the planet. I think that what gets me excited personally, and when I can engage with people, is there are too many things that cannot be measured, but there are a lot that can be. And if we can expand our ability to measure and understand our world and our place in it, space as a single part, small part of this overall ecosystem, actually can, I think, bat way out of its, you know, fight way out of its weight class or whatever metaphor you want, because it can measure the whole globe. And Planet can measure every tree on the planet, and Capella can measure every building on the planet, whether or not it's raining. They can tell you how far the floodwaters have gone and whether they receded through the clouds. You can do this over the entire planet, and then there are satellites out at geosynchronous orbit that can tell you things every 20 minutes. And so these data historically haven't been used as effectively as they will be because there's so many trees out there that nobody knows how to start carrying. Right? But when we start to combine all of these data with artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can start to actually parse that into human approachable things. With the capital markets, my aha moment for why am I here was actually a class at HBS, and the professor was talking about the power of the firm in our society, and what you can do with a company in our society is pretty dang impressive. And sure, I can do physics and I can do lasers, but those 8 people that I talked about before, I didn't like them that much. I wanted to find something else. And so now I'm trying to combine these different fields, but it's not until you actually engage with people in what it is that matters to them that they get excited. So I've tried to get away from saying space is so cool, let me ram this down your throat. It's, you've got a lot of hard problems and we can be a part of how you will solve them. And that's the sort of the flip that occurred to me.
And that's the entrepreneurial mindset.
I pivoted and I moved from a deep defense contractor to a company with 5 people.
I mean, for me, the way I can bring people into what I see as the future is really talking about that next shore that we're going to sail up onto? And what will you be doing there? And if someone can get on that wavelength with me, then I've converted another lunatic.
Messaging. I mean, I think like I spoke about earlier, just messaging around AI, because that's my field, is just needs to be more of like we're on a team together. Like you don't need to be like, sometimes I wonder like if some people who understand AI, the field deeply, like a lot of them, if you talk to them, it's like, I am one, is that like they hear these things in the news and people ask me my opinions on these things in the news about AI, and it's like I just black it out. I'm like, I don't even want to do that, because I feel like there's an exploitation of people's like unknown fear and like everything like that. So like I think the messaging needs to be like more like open around what this field has to offer and just what it means and what we can do with it in a positive way. But as far as like messaging, I'm not sure exactly the answer, and like coming from like the side at NASA, but what's really worked for me is just like I said, making things more approachable and being like, hey, we do really cool stuff. Like, don't you want to do it with us? Like, like that's what I want to trend toward. Cause I wish everyone could, I know like you did work there and you said I had to work there, but like, I really love, there's parts that stink. Don't get me wrong. I know, but like, I really do feel so blessed working there, because like, I love just like feeling a part of that really cool, wonky community. And I like coming here tonight, like, so like shout out to the CIC, because it's like, I feel like I'm with a bunch of like-minded thinkers. And like, just even yesterday, like I was at Lincoln Lab and I was like, damn, I want to work here. Like, it's so cool here. Like, so I think like the messaging where it's like, sometimes when people hear I work at NASA, it's like, and I'm like, because it's not like, I feel so like, believe me, like even being an employee, I'm like when I went to DC, when they had like the Apollo kind of like 50-year tribute thing on the Capitol, that was like actually one of the first moments, and maybe like the last, where I like genuinely felt this like overwhelming emotion about working at NASA. I was like, and I actually like think I shed like one tear. I was like, but it was actually super impactful to be a part of that. But like, I think the messaging needs to be is like, we all really could be a part of that stuff. It doesn't have to just be NASA. I mean, I am proud of being a part of the agency that did that, and like with help from everybody else too. It's just like you feel a certain sense of duty, but the messaging needs to be much more like we're doing this together, because it's so much more fun when you do this with other people. So yeah,
We are in this
But-
together.
But I loved my time at NASA. Don't get me wrong. It was the circumstances of it.
No, it's
I mean,
same. Like,
guard a freighter or work at NASA.
right.
Yeah,
And
but
honestly, it had an impact on you because you're like doing things in the face of you now. So
loved it, and
Yeah.
and the toys were amazing.
yeah.
I would love this conversation to go on forever, but we'll bring it around so that people can talk. I want to allow Cynthia kind of a last opportunity to say or ask anything.
So I know we've talked about a lot of different things, and we've touched on different topics, from democratizing data to monetizing things to imaginary blockchain currencies that don't exist yet. But I think some core things that we can take away, at least from my own perspective, is that one, we absolutely need to work with our space scientists, our space engineers, all of these space people. And similarly, these space people have to look above their desks and above their computers. That's one. Number two, I think that not just investors, but as a collective, at a certain point, we have to just accept fear and just jump off, because where we are headed to now, we inevitably all, and forgive me for how blunt this is, we will all die. And the planet, as Blair said, will continue on as it is. We've seen that with Venus. Venus used to have a climate similar to Earth, and now it does not, but it is still a planet. So Earth will still be here. It is a matter of whether or not we will still be here. And so I don't know about y'all. I'm not a scientist, but between these two options, I'm going to take that leap of faith. And I think number three, I think we need to challenge our our private and public funding entities to look beyond a profit. And I know that that's a seemingly impossible task because we're capitalists. We're capitalists, but I think we also have to remember that all forms of currency are made up. So at a certain point, people over profit. And so those are the things that I think I've walked away from. And
You're really good at absorbing information.
jealous. And so I think with all of those things, I think that I would not only challenge myself, but I would challenge everyone in this room to really think about what, not just climate action, but what humans and what humanity would look like if we all did come together, regardless of our fears, regardless of these imaginary, boundaries that we have put, that we have placed upon ourselves, for the better collective. And I think we all always want that, but it's a matter of how do we get 8 billion people to see that.
Such a great recap. The word that comes to mind as you're talking is like stewards. Like, how do we embrace this like stewardship model of protecting the earth, of growing with it? And if we earn that right to stay alive by, making the right decisions collectively, then maybe we spread our stewardship to the universe and our species is alive for thousands of years because of the work being done here today and, because of the conversations that we're having. So ultimately, we're all in this together. Here at NewViews, our program is continuing to grow. We're trying to have people on that will engage. Thank you all for engaging. This is we're trying to take this deeper dive in. I really learned a lot, got inspired a lot, and I hope you in the audience did as well. So with that, thank you and have a good night, everybody.